Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we're going to be talking about the long-awaited sophomore album from Ex Hex called It's Real. You know, it's going to be a cheap tagline repeated by a lot of fans and critics alike following this group upon hearing that the album is dropping. But yeah, it's true, it's obvious, somehow it's real. We're getting another Ex Hex album. Now, for those of you who are out of the loop, Ex Hex is a scuzzy, garage-leaning, almost punk indie rock act fronted by Mary Timony, who you might know from Helium or especially in recent years from her involvement with Wild Flag, an all-too-brief project fronted by Carrie Brownstein of Sleater-Kinney that put out one really great album and then kind of folded when Sleater-Kinney reformed. And honestly, I thought a similar fate was gonna crop up for Ex Hex. Mary Timony pulled up Betsy Wright on bass and Laura Harris on drums, and they cut together a straightforward but critically adored album called Rips back in 2014. Now, I did review that album 5 years ago, and while I was a little bit cooler on it than most, Mary Timony has never quite wowed me as a frontwoman, and there are some rough patches in the production, but the hooks, they were phenomenal, and the writing was pretty uniformly great, which led the project to maintain some really solid replay value for me as just a great three-piece rock act. But it's been 5 years. You'd think the group would strike when the iron was hot, especially with all the critical acclaim and all the touring they were doing. I thought we were not getting a sophomore album, but we finally did get a follow-up. So what did Ex Hex deliver on It's Real? Well, here's the thing. If you're just happy hearing Ex Hex back on their scuzzy, hook-driven grind where the melodic riffs are plentiful, you will absolutely get that from this project. This is a band with such solid fundamentals that a base level of quality is kinda baked in. But that being said, the more listens I gave to It's Real, the more I got the uncanny feeling that despite the trio beefing up some of their sound thanks to choices in guitar tone and production, there's an odd sense that Ex Hex is looking backwards with this album. And it's kinda tough to describe because this album doesn't really feel like it's pandering to the raucous critics that were always gonna overpraise this approach. But if you're the sort who really gets off on some obvious parallels in tone and melodic progression to classic rock, I can see this being absolutely the album for you, even if that might have come at the expense of where the band could have gone in other areas. In other words, it's not quite as experimental in certain more interesting ways, and thus I don't quite think it's a great album, at least for me. But it also means that criticizing this album gets a little bit tricky, because while the easy route for me is just to rattle off all the tones to which Ex Hex is paying homage, which span from Thin Lizzy, The Velvet Underground, and Def Leppard to Joan Jett, Blondie, and Pat Benatar, what I find a lot more interesting is how Ex Hex will step beyond their influences. Now, granted, one of the big problems of beefing up some of the scuzz and the riffs and the distortion is that Mary Timony still isn't a powerhouse singer in the same way that many of those late 70s, early 80s rock singers were. That's one of the reasons why Rips had more stripped-back, contemporary indie rock songs that her voice could match and complement. So, the solution that she, the band, and producer Jonah Takagi decided to do is pile on the reverb, pump up the backing vocals and overdubs, and hope to God the melodic hooks will stick more directly. Which, alright, yeah, I could have seen working if Mary Timony had even a trace of rawness or deeper edge to her delivery like Pat Benatar or Joan Jett or Debbie Harry did. But her throatier timbre and more stately delivery doesn't really ratchet up the intensity or tension the way it should, which, kinda correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't that kind of the point of that raw era of garage and arena rock that they're calling back to? Now, granted, that prim but cutting professionalism was always a factor with Ex Hex, but it is a bit of a jarring fit now when there are so many moments to serve as homage. More to the point, it's hard to avoid the feeling that Ex Hex are still looking for other tones and choices and ideas to differentiate themselves as a three-piece, and I'm not convinced that they really add that much to some of the choices they made. Wanna Be True descends into a blown-out noise rock bridge that doesn't fit well with anything, and that's just as true, if not more so, about the compressed vocal filters on No Reflection and Talk to Me. And I'd be fine with them if they felt like knowing callbacks, but just like on the debut, with some of the odder production detours, they feel kind of superfluous, as attempts to bring in a modern touch that doesn't really mesh with everything else here, especially when they could have just fixed my biggest production quibble from the last album and given the kick drums and snares some actual consistent punch. And you know, I say all that with the acknowledgement, again, that the rest of the album is really goddamn solid, and even in some cases it hits harder than Rips did. The main melody on Rainbow Shiner is nasty as all hell, even if the vocals are a little bit drowned out on Good Times, still a killer tune. The jangling bounce, great bass line, and terrific solo on Diamond Drive, it's very reminiscent of the Velvet Underground in the best possible way. And while Another Dimension does feel a little bit oddly long, it's a phenomenal rock song that would not sound out of place in 1983 and kicks just about as much ass. And you know what? I'd be remiss to not highlight the songwriting, where again, Mary Timony shows a lot of chops in writing some really well-framed relationship toxicity, even if it's a little bit hard to avoid how much her songwriting is retracing similar arcs to what we got on Rips. Once again, we've got her keen eye for the unsteady deflections of male ego and insensitivity that's less out of active malice and rather a sense of cluelessness and inability to fully process guys' own emotions. But given that the sound is bigger this time around, the metaphors are naturally bigger as well, framing them as forces of nature across elemental lines. But for as much as you could raise the same questions that I had with Rips, the slightly patronizing air taken with some of these guys that for some reason she continues to be drawn to time and time again, I do like some of the subtler flaws and hints that cast her own insecurities and failings in sharper relief in order to level the scales. This is where cranking up the old school rock and roll veneer has some value for blinding them both in raw but shallow emotion that still has value and appeal to this day, highlighting the disposability of it all. But songs like Diamond Drive highlights a mirrored situation in the willful blindness on the first couple of songs, where she's ready to move on with jaded exasperation and he's the one that's seeing feelings materialize. And the vampirism implied on No Reflection, it's a great metaphor on how guys, they love to cultivate the moody and mysterious vibe, but they never truly encounter the darker insecurities within themselves, and yet she's still drawn to it all the same. There is some appeal there. And yet if we're looking for the most concrete departure from Rips, it's how the themes ultimately resolve, at least on the surface. I mean, that project was quite clear as how when the bad relationship snaps into view both logically and emotionally, it's pretty much doomed. And that's a very rational conclusion to reach. But it's also a very lonely place that can lead to self-destructive levels of introspection, whereas It's Real chooses to lean into more of an emotional truth that has persisted between the two of them. Hell, they're both self-destructive, image-obsessed, and distant with each other, making sense maybe on Another Dimension where both are forces of nature that seem more caught in each other's natural gravity wells than anything else. So in a dispassionate, uncaring world, why not try to make something make sense? Which is why you get the note of possible reconciliation on Talk to Me that had some potential, and yet the ambiguous ending leaving her waiting is very telling indeed. In other words, it could very well echo Rips and how placing faith in such a person is a really bad idea, but it leaves the door open and the chance to be wrong. And while I'm not sure that's more mature, it does feel more honest and honestly a little bit more human. I respect that. So as a whole, look, again, if you liked Rips, you're probably gonna like this as well. As Ex Hex, they're a streamlined hook delivery system with scuzzy riffs, solid bassline, and some great solos. They're a meat and potatoes rock act through and through with writing that consistently punches higher. But on some level, I keep expecting there to be more with this band, and with the more obvious callbacks to earlier acts, it feels like the sound is only haphazardly living up to the promise and potential and the subtle complexity that comes in the writing. And on some level, I'm convinced this should hit harder than it really does, have a bit more of an edge. As such, for me, it does feel like a bit of a lateral move from Rips, which is why I'm giving this a 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, but a bit of a qualified one. If you like that 2014 project, you want to hear more, this will certainly satisfy, and going backwards, vice versa. Otherwise, it's still worth a listen, but I would check some of your expectations. Again, good, not great. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, this was an interesting listen. If you want to buy or stream the album, links down there below. And I got the poll up there. I know not many people are probably going to care about this. It's hard to tell how much buzz that certain indie bands have, and this is one of those cases, but hey, I'm curious what your opinions are. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you want to support the channel, link to my Patreon right over there. Definitely happy for any possible support. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.